and real good, so I want to try and do something a little different here and tell you the story, at least as I'm beginning to put it together. You've seen pictures of places, and I'm reaching a point where I feel those are nice. You know, it's kind of a travelogue and saying, well, these were really beautiful places, and wouldn't it be nice to go and visit? But there's a story that's behind those places that goes with them, and it involves the people who traveled through. And that I find is really more compelling to me. So I hope to share some of the story with you. And to do that, I had to penetrate what I call the black hole of colonial history. You know, you all know about this thing over here, Plymouth Rock. You know, when we were all at school, they probably still do this, every Thanksgiving you talk about Plymouth Rock. And then you move on to Lexington and Concord. Because that stuff in between was really boring, and we didn't want to do that. We don't want to do things that are boring. But that's about 150 years that we never really touch on. And one of the key figures, of course, in looking at this is this time period is Thomas Hooker. And as a person, and you know, he's down there on the State House and in the center of Hartford, and all those signs along the way. And it's kind of hard to get into who Thomas Hooker is when, at this distance, when you say, gee, he was a scholar, widely written and read, minister, reformer. You go on about all the things that he was part of founding with Hartford in Connecticut, and the New England Confederation, which I learned about. They were trying something really radical of getting the colonies to work together for mutual aid and defense. A statesman for resolving conflicts. And some would say father of American democracy. So you kind of go, wow, how do you get around that? And there was an aspect of Thomas Hooker that isn't up there on the signs, but I think it's an important part of the story, is that he was a father. He and his wife, Susannah, when they were coming across, they had 5 children. And my ancestor, Mary, was one of them, and she was about 12 years old. But they had children from, say, 14 years old to almost 3 years old. So they were traveling this great distance with their family. And there are things along the way was that I'm walking and looking at the rivers and things that they crossed, and I'm going, would I have done that? So in looking at this, my ancestor is Mary Hooker, and as I said, she was 12. And I'm trying to understand the world that she might have seen. And Mary went on in her life to marry Roger Newton, my other ancestor, and they had 8 children. And you can imagine what life must have been like before internet, TV, cable, radio. Might not be so hard after last winter's storms where you were out of power for more than 3 weeks. They tell stories at night. And that's how oral traditions were handed down. Tell us the story about. And so if we could imagine Mary Hooker telling the story of her father and her family and their travels to her children. So Thomas Hooker doesn't become this high figure, he's a grandfather. And unfortunately he passed away, he died before he really got to see and know his grandchildren. So Mary would have gathered her children, and they'd say, tell us a story about, at the fire, and tell us a story about how you came here. She'd tell them she could remember, because she was 9 years old when they left England, so she'd well remember the time in England. That she'd remember and tell her children that their grandfather was a lecturer in a great church, St. Mary's Church in Chelmsford. This was a pretty rowdy town. It was a drinking town. And the drinking was getting out of hand, so the citizens were concerned, and they needed to bring this in. And one of the ways they did that was through the teachings in church and shaping the opinions of people in town. So Thomas Hooker was a shaper of the community, and he was beginning to have an effect on the town and a change. And during that time, they lived just outside of Chelmsford at Little Baddow at the Cuckoos farm. And she would tell her children, this was a really wonderful, warm house. And would have been one of the happy times in their life, living on the farm, as you could relate to living here in the country also, as a wonderful place to grow up and feel like you were setting down roots. And into their home, came John Eliot. And he came to live with the family and help Thomas establish a school at Little Baddow. And later, Eliot said, I never knew what love in a family could be till I went to live with the Hooker family. But there were troubles brewing in England at that time. And as we start to look back and say, what was happening? That the King, Charles, at that time, said, there's only one way that is allowed in doctrine and belief in England, and any others will be subject to the contempt they deserve. And he found a willing helper in Bishop William Laud, who was a small man, but took his power quite seriously. And when he became Bishop of London, he went down the list. He set out to cleanse the ministry of all those who were unorthodox. So he took the list and he went down O next to each the Orthodox ministers, and P next to the Puritans, and set about cleansing them in some ways that got rather nasty. And as he had Thomas Hooker on the list to be removed, and he removed him from his position in Chelmsford as lecturer, and tried to silence him. But it didn't seem to really work, because ministers from miles around came to meet with him at the Cuckoos farm in Little Baddow. And word got back to Laud that Hooker was not silenced. So he set out an order to arrest Thomas Hooker. And Hooker had to go into hiding rather than facing arrest. And 49 ministers signed a petition to Laud to have Hooker relieved of the charges, which was you talk about that John Hancock being, let the king see this, when you have 49 ministers do that. But Laud could have nothing of it, so Hooker had to go into hiding. And he went to his friend's home, Samuel Stone, in Towcester, and the secret police came and banged on the door to arrest Hooker, and Samuel said, he was over there an hour ago, just down the street here. Go that way and get him. And Hooker had to go out the back door and go into exile in Holland, and wasn't really reunited with the family until 1633. At that time, Laud became Archbishop of Canterbury, which is, it's sort of like, this week we have a new pope. The Archbishop of Canterbury was like the pope of the English church. The king was above him, and then God. So the Puritans knew that they would not be able to make change in England once Laud was in charge. And in 1633, the Hooker family boarded the Griffin and sailed for 2 months, and from June to September, arriving in Boston in 1633. With 200 others of the congregation below deck for 2 months. And we can think, that this certainly wasn't a Carnival cruise. I had to throw that in. Might have been better. Not great. Little did they know. Although, imagine traveling if you were on one of the ships that came over in the winter on the North Atlantic. So they arrived in Boston, and this is one of those things you find out as you dig in, that Mary Hooker, or Susannah Hooker, in November 1633 gave birth to Samuel Hooker. So for those of you who can relate to being pregnant below deck on a wooden ship bouncing for 2 months across the ocean, you wonder how they did it. So life became comfortable in Newtown, which later became Cambridge. But plans were already started on the pilgrimage to Connecticut. that shortly after they got here, I think the planning was going on in England. And in 1636, the congregation met on the Common in Cambridge, opposite Harvard, and began their journey west. And they left with most of the congregation and driving the 160 cattle, which the story was that they drank milk along the way, and that's what sustained them. If they had too much raw milk, I think that wouldn't sustain them. Probably a lot of the milk went on the ground. But they did trade with the natives to help trade for food and corn and beans and meats to gain. And Mary walked, my ancestor walked beside her mother, who rode on this carriage to Connecticut. And there were those who said, well, she was an invalid. But you think if she had a 6-year-old, a 5-year-old, and an almost 3-year-old, she had her hands full. And to ask a 3-year-old to walk to Connecticut, I don't know if I'd ask. So they traveled to Connecticut. At that time, the wilderness, the interior was unknown. There were towns and settlements, and they came much later. So it took about 2 weeks. So we figure, walking behind the cows, we figure, well, maybe about 10 miles a day. It would have been easy to get lost, because there were hundreds of trails, if not thousands of trails that kept branching off, so they needed a guide. And the natives were friendly at that point, and they provided guidance. Probably in 2020 hindsight, their spirits up there are saying, why on earth did we do that? But they did, leading on down to Connecticut. The stories that came afterwards was this was a trackless wilderness. They were lost, walking with a compass for 2 weeks, and they stumbled to the Connecticut. And others thought, well, gee, it was kind of like a walk in the park. It was a party all the way. It was a long walk. Imagine walking 10 miles a day and carrying belongings. The wilderness then was, the woods were open because the natives would burn the woods in the fall so that you'd get rid of all the brush. And they did that for hunting and for travel so that they could walk through the woods without being ambushed. And along the way, they would have passed, imagine passing the native villages like the Wibbequassets up here in Woodstock and the lodges that they lived in. And it would be hard to imagine living in a bark home where the natives said, we're quite comfortable here. And they'd live with their parents and their grandparents and aunts and uncles. They'd have a whole extended family living in one lodge. And they'd be comfortable right through the winter. And that'd be hard to imagine given how cold most of the English homes were. And along the way they saw rich soil and farmland, and especially up in towards Woodstock, they saw land that had 40 acres of corn, and 40 bushels an acre. There was rich farmland, and the people on the journey wanted to stop there. But they stayed together as a congregation, as a group, to complete the journey. And they passed Indian named places like Manchog, and I'm not going to say it, I'm not going to do a whole thing, Chabungamog. It's longer now. But the greatest danger that they faced would be crossing the rivers. And if you went at the wrong place at the wrong time, you could be swept away. So their guides, in scouting the path and showing the best way for families to travel, and they were traveling on foot, they were walking, led them to places like here at the Quinnebog River, where the water is wide and shallow and a gravel bottom, and the banks are low, so you can step right out in and walk right onto the other side. And along the way, because of the need to travel and cross streams, the roads that we now have down in the valleys, we have bridges for. And if you look at the Mount Hope River down along Route 44, it's a fairly wide and deep spot. You go no more than 2 or 3 miles upstream, you can step right across. So you can see the ease of traveling across the hills. And there'd be places along the way that they might have seen. Others had come and placed stones in the brooks to make it easier to cross. And of course those beaver dams. We don't realize any of the pests now. The beavers were there everywhere. And in fact, at that time, it was said that the first arrivals, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they were sustained by two things, the beaver and the Bible. Maybe it should be the Bible and the beaver, but I think the beaver is the one that paid the bills. Because at that time, the fur trade was what sustained them through the time until they had other exports to send back to England. And the natives would do things like running across the top of the beaver dams to get across rather than walking around. I'm going to share with you a short clip here of, there is a place up on Pine Hill, and this would have been where they arrived about the 7th day on the trail. And you can walk across the ridge today, and there's a wide roadway there that likely was set there around in the 1700s and has now been forgotten, and travels across the top of the hill and then down to the Mount Hope, towards the Mount Hope River. And this was a place that they had camped. And the story was from Larned and from Chisholm that this was where the Hooker party camped along the way up on Pine Hill. Say the darkest hours. Imagine traveling 7 days by foot. The 8th day, you're looking across and you see more wilderness, and you wonder, how will you ever get out of the wilderness? Will it ever end? Even though you're passing over streams and lakes and ponds, and if we look at it today, we'd say it's really quite beautiful. But at that time, I'm sure their thoughts were simply to endure and get on their way to the Connecticut. Oops, got a music here. Over the hills, and for those of you who were from Willington, yes, I did go over the hill in Willington, on down to the Willimantic River. And as they came down to the river, they would be at a point of hope as they're crossing the river. We're headed down the last bit of the hill to the Willimantic. And by the end of the 8th day, it's likely that they ended their day crossing the Willimantic. So on the 9th day, they had a ray of hope in that they were close. And going up the path towards what we know as Paul Kill, which was a landmark along the path. And if you go up Paul Hill, it's crossing over the Great Divide, and that you're entering the Connecticut Valley. And they must have stopped in wonder as they crossed over and saw the valley before them, that they'd traveled 2 months at sea and 2 weeks on the trail to see a rich, wide valley laying out before them. So they were truly home when they arrived in Connecticut, in Hartford. Now, I'm not from Connecticut, obviously, so I can talk about this, and maybe that's a good thing, because I'm learning it fresh. You probably knew it all along. That they were sustained on a journey. And looking at the story of Connecticut, the state seal says, he who, I won't do the Latin, because I won't do chabungamog in long form. I'm not going to do the Latin either. He who transplanted still sustains. And the story of this, there's a couple of pieces there, that the vines, going back in Scripture, go back to the Psalms, and other places across the Old and New Testament relating to the transplanting of the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt to the Promised Land. And the vines, as I understand, it's one interpretation, the vines on the seal represent those 3 communities of Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor. There are a couple of other interpretations I've heard, but that's one of them, as the communities that were transplanted. And that journey that, from the oppression that they felt in England, and travel across the waters and the wilderness, in many ways, I'm sure they carried with them through their preaching and the sermons that they heard as truly a biblical experience. Their work wasn't done in their journey. Shortly after they arrived, in 1638, the towns came together, and Thomas Hooker once again was called upon to lead. And in his sermon, he said, the foundation of authority is the free consent of the people. And he had vision that he laid out of a place in government that he shared with them, that government could be established by the people, and those that the people put in authority of the government could be removed if they failed in their work. And so, yeah, wouldn't you like that now? On January 14, 1639, in the time in between the initial sermon and 1639 when they met, the freemen of the three towns voted, and I learned this later, they voted in secret, because what they were doing was something so radical that they were afraid that they would be subject to persecution by the king. And what they did was affirm the fundamental orders which established the first written constitution to create a government. And it was a government with authority granted by the people, with rights to protect the people. And the thing that, as I looked at this and the journey that they were making, they left England where the king was the authority. In all the other colonies, the groups that came with a charter giving authority from the king to establish a government. And here's a band that traveled down three communities. All those families, there are probably 200-300 families, I figure, coming together to do something that had never been done before. They took the belief that we, the people, can establish a government. We, the people, can confer it with authority. And that didn't require the king. So they were truly doing something not only radical, it breaches on treasonous. But they set in motion what I now believe, as I'm filling in this gap of my black hole on colonial history, they started the American Revolution. And 150 years later, that document, we all know the first three words of We the People, was built upon what they said and what they accomplished. So what would happen to Mary Hooker's story, and why haven't I heard about this? In thinking about this, Mary and Roger had 8 children, and all the other families, they had lots of children. And their children had lots of children, and they started moving around. Some came this way. Some, like my ancestors, some of them went up to Vermont. In our family history, my ancestors went to Vermont in 1777 with the ox team on the ice in the dead of winter. They set up their home in Hartford, and they had 16 children, which is, when I say prolific, and for each child they planted a maple tree around the house. And some of those trees are still there. Others in our family went west, and along with other families, they went up the Mohawk Valley to Ohio and Iowa and Nebraska and on west. Some down, we have ancestors that went down to Texas in the early years. In short, they were part of that expansion of America, and they carried stories. But they didn't carry Mary Hooker's story or the stories of those people who came from England. They carried the stories of their own journey. But the values of the stories that they told, and I'm sure they shared at their family hearth, were the ones that we go back to this out of bondage into a hopeful land, a land of promise. And that story got woven together from all those families into what I call the American story. And we think how powerful that story became when we look at the people later who came, who heard the story. My wife and I visited Poland about 5 years ago, and we got to go to her grandfather's home out on the plains. And he heard the story in the middle of Poland, and he came here, and her grandmother came from Lithuania. They're hearing the stories. We're all descended from people who, in one way or another, heard a story of promise and hope, and we came. But just as the American Revolution, I think, began down here, down the road, with those families coming together, I think that a big part of the spirit of that American story came down that path with them. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website